Today's episode is brought to you by NordVPN. In the last episode, we saw Jacob prosper as he bred both stronger and larger quantities of cattle than Laban could. This came about against all odds, for as Jacob had selected the speckled and spotted animals, those which were fewer in number, he was still able to grow more than Laban by using what some believe was an advanced selective breeding process, and also the faith in his God. Naturally, seeing Jacob succeed in such a capacity was envied by Laban and his sons, and before long, Jacob got the sense that his father-in-law's attitude had changed towards him. So with this, he convinced his wives to leave with him, and following the command of his God, Jacob and his family would make their way back to Canaan in the hopes of reuniting with his own people, and perhaps, more importantly, escaping the clutches of the sinister Laban. Before we get there though, a brief message from the sponsor of today's episode, NordVPN. A VPN stands for a virtual private network, and is a service offered by NordVPN that will encrypt your internet activity and also protect your identity when online. With so much of our sensitive information now stored online, from bank details to home addresses, internet security is a must-have for any browser of the web. NordVPN will ensure that all of your internet usage is redirected through a specially configured remote server, which will see your IP address hidden and encrypt all the data you send and receive. This means your data will be unreadable to any would-be hackers. So there's no need to worry about connecting to the Wi-Fi at the airport or at your local coffee shop, because with NordVPN, your passwords, banking details, credit card numbers, and other private details will all be encrypted. Personally, I've used NordVPN to change my IP address to bypass region lock content. Indeed, NordVPN can also make your IP address appear like you're somewhere else from around the world. With over 5,000 servers worldwide, NordVPN gives you the ability to manipulate your IP address to appear in a completely different country, which is great if you're in an area where content is region locked or restricted, or if you're away from home and can't access your favourite shows because of country-specific restrictions. With a simple click, you can assimilate your IP address into another country, allowing you to access the full scope of the internet as it should be. Right now, NordVPN is offering a great deal where every purchase of a 2-year plan will get you an additional month with a huge discount. Just go to nordvpn.com/thelegend and use the code LEGENDS. And now back to Jacob's great escape as he heads on home. Jacob and his family are able to cross the Euphrates River and head for the hill country of Gilead, all without Laban having realised at all. It isn't until 3 days have passed does Laban even realise they've left, where he is told by his sons that Jacob had fled. Laban then takes his relatives with him and pursues Jacob for a total of 7 days, where he catches up to him in the hill country of Gilead. It's hard to say what Laban's intentions were for sure, but it can be argued that he definitely meant to cause Jacob harm. His envy for Jacob's success had already consumed him, but now that Jacob had fled, and with his daughters too, his anger would have certainly boiled over, and there may have been very little to stop him from even killing Jacob, out of both jealousy and rage. But we see here that God comes to Laban and appears to him in a dream, where he warns him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." One might say that by this, it's clear that Laban did have bad intentions, and that he was either talked down by God here in his dream, or was ultimately threatened by God to spare Jacob. Now, we understand that Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead, and that before too long, Laban and his relatives had found the place too. When Laban locates Jacob, he approaches him and asks him, "What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off so secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps. You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing." With these statements, we see that Laban heeds God's words and does not resort to anger. However, he does not hold back his disappointment and attempts to shame Jacob by suggesting that had he been honest, Laban would have given his blessing and celebrated his departure. But we know this is probably untrue, because Jacob had already requested his freedom, and Laban proceeded to bargain with him instead. You might say that Laban, unable to resort to anger out of fear of God, and unable to really force Jacob to return, resorts to playing the pity card and establishes himself as the victim. He determines that Jacob has conducted himself dishonestly, that he has kidnapped his daughters, as opposed to liberating them, and that he has even denied him of his grandchildren. This is actually quite ironic, given that Laban hadn't even noticed they were missing until his sons had told him they were gone. Laban continues, "I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's household, but why did you steal my gods?" Here Laban reveals that he had spoken with Jacob's God, and though he acknowledges that he was told not to say anything good or bad, he proceeds to contradict himself by telling Jacob that he has the power to harm him. You might say that Laban was at the height of his frustration here, for though he wished to harm Jacob, he was also fearful that his God would protect him. So he resorts to intimidating Jacob, reminding him that he could harm him, but that he is choosing not to. In actuality, it's likely that if Laban did try to harm Jacob, then God would have struck him down, or somehow prevented him from delivering his attack. Moreover, he demands to know why his gods were stolen, which shows us the priorities in Laban's life, that he didn't notice his daughters were missing, but knew his idols were. Despite having spoken to God in his dream, it's interesting that Laban still clings to his own gods, those which you might say were inanimate. Jacob's response to all this is somewhat disappointing, where he cites the reason they left in such secrecy was because he was afraid. He states, "I was afraid, because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force." Whilst this may be true, it's funny that Jacob had some choice words for Laban when talking to his wives in the previous chapter, but when it comes to addressing those matters to Laban's face, he hides behind the excuse of being scared. Truth be told, it might be said that Jacob probably was scared of Laban, for surely here and now would be the ideal opportunity to vent his frustrations of the past 14 years, as he worked in servitude to Laban. Not only this, but it would have been the perfect rebuttal to Laban's attempt to shame his character, and would have not only put Laban in his place, but probably humbled him into defeat. Though you might also say that Jacob was wise to de-escalate the situation like this, for if he had spoken his mind, he may have tipped Laban over the edge and brought harm upon himself and his family. Jacob continues of Laban's gods, "But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it." Now Jacob had no idea that Rachel had stolen the gods from Laban, and in declaring his innocence, issued a harsh punishment for the thief, death no less. He was of course unaware that the culprit was his own wife. The Bible tells us, "So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the 2 female servants. But he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods, and put them inside her camel saddle, and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing." We see here that Rachel does not come clean about her involvement in seizing Laban's gods, but instead rolls with the situation and aims to hold on to them. It might be said that she was fearful that by admitting her involvement, Jacob would have to be true to his word and kill her. But another idea is that she took such a risk to hold on to the gods so as to prevent her father from continued idolatry. After all, if her father did not have the gods, then he could not pray to them, and perhaps in this, he would eventually find his way to the biblical God, or at least not be punished for worshipping another. Rachel proves to be just as shrewd as Jacob, and it is clear that she, like her father, has mastered the art of deception by telling her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." By this, Rachel creates the perfect hiding place for the idols, a place that Laban won't search, having learned that she is on her period. In the end, Laban does not find his gods, and probably comes to the conclusion that they are not here amongst Jacob's camp. But then it is Jacob's turn to be angry, and he takes Laban to task, asking him, "What is my crime? How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring your animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night." In this, we come to see a more authentic side of Jacob. An angry side, true, but a side that was likely simmering and waiting to explode. He declares here not only his own innocence in choosing to leave Laban, but also lists his many responsibilities and how he had gone above and beyond what was asked of him, something that Laban may not have appreciated until now. Furthermore, we also see Jacob proceed to rebuke Laban for having searched through his things, and here he appears to take offense to the accusation of having stolen his gods, especially given that Laban doesn't find them here. He then goes into more detail about his service to Laban, stating that the goats did not miscarry under his guidance, and that he never once ate from Laban's cattle, even though he could have. He even replaced the cattle that were torn away by wild beasts with his own animals, instead of making excuses for these losses. Such was the commitment that Jacob had to the tasks that Laban gave him, even though these tasks and their conditions were brutal and unfair. He continues, "This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you for 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Once more, Jacob paints a picture for Laban, detailing just how harsh his labour was, as he continues to describe the weather, the effect it had on his body, and how such conditions caused him to lose sleep. This, as we know, went on for 20 years, and never did Jacob appear to complain or seek respite. He simply endured it in silence. So his outburst here may be forgiven, given that Laban appears to be completely ignorant of these circumstances, or at the very least didn't seem to care much, so long as his enterprise under Jacob was growing, which it did. Jacob also expresses how unfair Laban was with his wages, noting that he had changed them 10 times, despite how hard-working he was. But it is the final sentence of his rant that really hits home for both believers and for Laban, for Jacob derives some satisfaction in declaring that the God of Abraham now protected him, and that it was this God that prevented Laban from acting against him. From this, believers may take home the message that so long as one is loyal to God, as Jacob is seen to be in these recent events, then eventually God will give them relief, regardless of how hard their circumstances may be. For example, Jacob had to wait through 20 years of agonizing work before God gave him instruction to leave Laban and make it on his own. Now you might argue that Jacob could have really left at any time he wanted, but it wasn't until this moment did he receive God's blessing to do so. It might be said that given Jacob's previous trickster ways, God wanted to ensure that Jacob had changed, and so prolonged his suffering for the extent of 20 years before providing him with respite. It's interesting to note here though that Jacob doesn't actually refer to God as his own, but instead refers to him as Abraham's God. This may simply be Jacob adding weight to God's importance, in that it was once the God of Abraham, he who would have been a legend in these parts. But it could also be seen as a remaining part of reluctance by Jacob in refusing to completely associate this God as his own, perhaps an indication of not entirely being convinced of God's power. Having heard all of Jacob's complaints, frustrations, and sufferings, Laban proceeds to pretty much ignore everything he said, and instead implies that Jacob ought to be thankful, for everything he has come from him. He tells Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about these children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." It's pretty bold of Laban to not only dismiss Jacob's suffering by not even acknowledging it, but also proposing that Jacob should be grateful for what he has. Laban lays claim to Jacob's cattle, wives, and even his children, but then proceeds to paint himself as a kind and generous figure by allowing Jacob to have them. Perhaps in an effort to avoid being challenged over this deluded claim, Laban is quick to suggest that the two of them establish something of a covenant, a pact, if you will, that not only binds them both to a certain set of rules, but also ensures that neither party can wrong the other, for God will punish the offender. To actualize this pact, a monument is built out of stone, a modest pillar that signifies the agreement between Jacob and Laban. To some, it also served as a boundary by which Laban and Jacob were essentially drawing lines in the sand. As far as Laban tells us though, the stone pillar served as a witness, for he states, "This heap is a witness between you and me today. May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives beside my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me." Laban named the monument Jegar Sahadutha, but according to the Bible, it was also known as Mizpah. To Jacob, however, the pillar was called Gilead, and you can see here that the two parties were so hostile to one another that they couldn't even agree on a name for it. Laban continues of the covenant between them that, "Here is the heap, and here is the pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." Perhaps the most striking thing you'll notice about this deal is not only how Laban takes control of the situation by assigning the new terms, but how he also seals these terms under the eyes of Abraham's God, and not his own. We know that Laban was worshipping other gods, yet he does not call upon them to witness the covenant, but specifically speaks of the former. You might consider this a contradiction on Laban's behalf, though it might also be an indicator of how instinctively Laban knew that his gods were not as powerful as the biblical God, and so believed it best to validate the terms of the covenant under him. It's also interesting that Jacob does not propose any of his own terms at all, but instead falls in line with Laban's suggestions without question. Perhaps this is because he just wanted to be free of Laban, and whilst Laban's terms were insulting in that they questioned his care and loyalty to his wives, withstanding this slight may have been worth it if it meant never having to see Laban ever again. But another reason why Jacob held his tongue could again be because deep down, he feared Laban, and because he didn't fully trust his God, noting he did refer to God as Abraham's God previously, he was not confident in setting his own stipulations for this agreement, perhaps wary of backlash from Laban. But by the end of this agreement, the Bible tells us that Jacob does take an oath before the stone pillar, and he offered a sacrifice here to confirm the covenant before the eyes of God. After he and his relatives had eaten here, the family spent the night here, seemingly in peaceful cohesion with Laban. The next morning though, Laban is seen to kiss his grandchildren and his daughters farewell, before returning home. This sequence of affection by Laban is quite out of character for a man who seemed to not really regard his daughters as anything more than a means to entrap Jacob. But when you consider the fact that this is the last time Laban will see his daughters and grandchildren, on the account that the new agreement prevents him from entering Canaan, one may feel some sympathy for Laban and understand his sudden sentiment. Yet you might also say that Laban reaped what he sowed, and in effect, orchestrated his own fate, for after having used his daughters to snare Jacob, and after having exploited Jacob in an effort to increase his own flocks, in the end, he ends up with neither. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode on Biblical Stories Explained, then don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.